Now let's talk about your report guideline and also the actual proposal. Okay, so I made an announcement, and so if you go to the announcement here, and then I basically kind of told you what to do, and but that just kind of tell you that okay, so it's due on April 7, so which is tomorrow. And the thing that I kind of want to tell you is that if you don't submit this, you can still submit it. It's just that I will start to basically tell you whether or not if this is acceptable article and if your topic is acceptable. Now you should not start writing your report until you have your article and your topic approved, because if it's not approved by me and then when I read them in May, I am not gonna like it and you're gonna get a horrible grade. I guarantee you this. Okay. All right. So what you want to do is you want to give me the topic that you want to cover. So for instance, um, let's say, and it should be a very specific topic that you want to cover. So things like how does addition impact and working memory? How does sleep deprivation affect stress level? How does social interaction affect emotional processing? All of these stuff. So this it should be a very specific cover. It should not be something that is very general, like I want to do something on memory. I want to do something on sleep, or something like I want to I want to take a look at neurons, or something like I want to look at development. If you give me like a bogus one, not bogus, but if you give me a very broad topic like that, I'm gonna tell you no, you need to narrow it down. Okay, so it should be a very specific, very narrow topic that has to do with cognitive neuroscience. Okay. Now the second thing you want to give me is you want to give me the reference in APA format of the paper that you want to read. And this paper, it must be within 5 years, okay, which means that it's published 2015 or later. And so after your proposal is approved, then you can start writing your paper. Okay. Now so what is the guideline? Well, the guideline is also posted. So let's go to content and let's go down to this article report reading guideline. Okay, so let's say after it's approved. Yeah, so you have the proposal of the topic, you have the proposal of your article, and then after that is approved, then you can start writing your report. So your report should have several specific sections. You must have a background information. Okay, so the background information is basically saying that uh, in this field, in this topic, what prior study has found already. Okay, and the second thing you want to talk about is what your article's research question and what their hypothesis or hypotheses are. Okay, and you want to describe them and then tell me what makes this paper that you're reading, what makes it so unique. Okay, and the third one is the method. Okay, so what techniques did they do? Did they use fMRI? Did they use optogenetics? Did they use behavior testing? Did they do immunocytochemistry? Did they use two-photon microscopy? Did they use confocal microscopy? They use like something that's completely new. I don't know. Tell me what they did. Okay, did they use transcranial magnetic stimulations? So all of these stuff. What did the technique do, and how does it answer their research question? Because sometimes there might be better way to use the technology, or there may be better questions to answer based on the technology. Okay. Okay, so that's the third thing you want to tell me. And then the fourth thing you want to tell me is what the results are and what their interpretations are. Now, don't give me something like, oh, they found a statistical significance. Tell me this what they are finding mean. Okay, don't just tell me that, oh, they compared the control and the stimulated uh, uh, groups and then they found a specific they have found a very specific effect, and then they found statistical significance. Don't tell me that if you do that, you get a horrible grade. Tell me what it means and what it implies. So let's say, for instance, they found that after stimulation, they saw a much greater area of the left hemisphere, specifically when it comes to the left angular gyrus that is being the both signal when increased. And then what this means is that during this test, there are a lot more blood that is being recruited, therefore presumably meaning that there are more neural activity that's going on within this area. And that signifies that this area may play a very essential role when it comes to um, this particular task. This is something that you should be saying in your results section. Just don't tell me something that there is a statistical significance. Well, I can read that myself, okay? I don't need you to tell me that, but I want you to see that if you really understand what the article is about. Okay, now the fifth one is really basically on the to see if you can think critically. Okay, so the fifth one is give your own unique critique about this article. So you want to talk about its pros and you want to talk about the cons. So pros, you want to say what is so special about the study and what was done well. And then the cons, you want to kind of say, oh, well, what can be improved in the future when other studies attempt to study a similar research question? Can they do something like a different technique? Can they do a different task? Or can they do like a different species? Maybe their research question was not good in the beginning. That can be kind of modified a little bit more. Is it too narrow? Is it too broad? Now tell me these kind of stuff that really kind of what you think that show me that you can think like a researcher. Okay, so now the report is going to be due on May 11th. And late report will not be accepted. Okay, so just make sure that you do this on time. And this, in terms of length, I want them in a one single space, and it should be somewhere between 1 and 2 pages. And I don't think there should be any longer than that. But if it's any longer than that, you need to narrow it down and then give me something that is more distilled rather than a bunch of unfiltered stuff for me to read. Okay, so that's about it. And then later on, let's talk about the lecture. Okay, thank you. Okay, so today we're talking about learning and memory. So this is going to span over 3 lectures. So learning is a process of acquiring of new information. So there is going to be an acquisition phase, and later on there is a maintenance phase. So you see that memory is created when something is learned. So therefore, you cannot have a memory of something if you did not learn anything. Okay, and now there are several aspects when it comes to the actual learning aspect. So there are several steps. So the first steps is encoding, and so this is coming info to be like stored basically. So this is the incoming info that needs to be stored. So basically, this is a contact point with something that is novel. All right, and then so there is an acquisition phase in which that there is a registration of input. So in other words, you can see that this is a very modality specific aspect. So let's say if something is coming to you from, let's say if you're reading something new information, what you're watching something new information, or if someone said something new to you, so you're like, I learned this. Okay, now it doesn't have to be just one modality, not just one sensory modality, but it can be coming from multiple sensory modalities. So let's say when you're watching a movie, you're basically a movie you haven't watched before, and then you're learning something from both visual as well as auditory modalities. Now, when you are eating something you have never eaten before, then you are learning it from you're encoding this information from gustatory aspects. Okay, so there's an encoding and there's a storage, and so the storage actually comes from the encoding aspect. So this represents a permanent record of the information. Okay, and the last part is the retrieval. So there is information comes in, that's the encoding, and then information gets maintained and stored at somewhere in your brain, and depends on what aspect of memory. And then there is the retrieval of using that. So the retrieval part is the utilization of the stored info to create a conscious representation or execution of a learned behavior. So this is what learning and memory is all about. There is encoding, there's storage, and there's retrieval. And without any one of them being defective, you can say that there's either a learning um, defect or there is a memory defect. Okay. Now, when it comes to the categorization of memory, there can be several aspects, but you can kind of categorize them into two main aspects. So the first main aspect is shorter term memory. Okay, so that is the sensory memory, the short term memory, and also the working memory. And there are the long term memory. On the long term memory, there are a lot of big aspects, but in big part, you can kind of make it into declarative memory and non-declarative memory, which, as you can see, is also called implicit memory. So we're going to go through each one of them a little bit. So let's first start with the sensory and short-term memory and the working memory aspect. Okay, now let's talk about sensory memory. Sensory memory is something that's very, very short-lived, and that is more limited to one specific modality. And at this point, there is not that much inter modality crossing that is regarded yet. And so there could be auditory memory, there could be visual memory, and there could be gustatory, there could be somatosensory memory. So all of these very short-term brief memory there is no crisscrossing of modality at this point yet. And so what sensory memory is that it's a very quick recalling or re-experiencing of what has just presented to you via the very specific sensory modality. And at this point, there is not that much attention that is needed. And now, if you want to kind of think about memory or information that comes in as individual building blocks, well, what attention is really is the gel or the glue that puts them all together. So sensory memory at this point is kind of like you coming into very specific memory blocks, and you haven't really coded them or grouped them into something that is meaningful yet. So sensory memory is something that is going to be very short-lived. That's a very basic format when it comes to the memory. And a lot of it does not really require attention because not a lot of it goes into your deeper processing, which is what we're going to talk about much later in this lecture. Okay, so next thing what we want to talk about is short-term memory. Okay, so short-term memory, when you kind of think about what sensory memory is, there are sensory registration of that comes in, right? Now, with the short-term memory, what you can have is like a short-term storage, and that requires attention. And when you have rehearsal of that, then becomes the long-term memory. Now, this is what the Atkinson and Shiffrin model kind of suggest. Right. Later on, we'll come and we'll say that there are some issues with this term of the modal model. Okay, so now the short-term memory, what people basically kind of think about is that this requires some attention to selectively filter out from the sensory modalities. And now the information, they are lost in two ways. They kind of think of it as decay or they think of it as interference. And there are a lot of issues with this kind of model memory, in which one later we're going to talk about all of them. Okay, now what are the short-term memory characteristics? So let's say if you present someone a sequence of items, and this is the short-term memory is responsible for the recency effect. So now you guys know that there is something called the primacy and recency effect, right? So the primacy effect is you tend to remember something that you were presented in the beginning, and then and the recency effect is you tend to remember the ones that are like in the last two or last three groups, and the people what the items doing in the middle, you don't really remember them very well. And so that's the primacy and recency effect. And now, so they think that the short-term memory characteristic is responsible for the recency effect of that. And what happened is that this the short-term memory does not really require that much of a rehearsal or the active maintenance. And one of the things, how long do you kind of hold this in your mind? Well, it turns out that not very long, that it's about like 1 minute. Sometimes you can have a slightly longer than 1 minute, but not that much longer than that. So something that is, so basically short-term memory is something that you kind of pay attention to and you can quickly recall them back into your existence. And now if it's something, if I give you someone's phone number, for instance, and then you repeated it like once or twice, and after 5 minutes I asked, oh, what was that person's phone number, and without looking at it you probably cannot recall that very well. You probably remember the area code, and that's because of the primacy effect. You probably remember it like the last two digits, and that's because of the recency effect. But you don't remember anything that is in the middle of that, and that is because it's not because they are decayed out, and it's not because it got interfered when you're encoding it, because doing that, because in the first 2 minutes you were able to correctly recall that. But rather what is going on is that what happened is that this phone number has not been more permanently registered into your consciousness, and so which means that it has not transferred enough from the short-term memory aspect, and has been manipulated and rehearsed enough to kind of becomes a more permanent basis of your storage. So it's not that it gets lost, and it's not because it got decayed, it's not got interfered, and that's because it has not been really kind of the word, I guess the word I'm looking for is it hasn't been permanently exerted itself into your entire experience. And this is why the short-term memory characteristic is typically about like 1 minute, 2 minutes, maximum. Okay, now how do neuropsychologists test for something we call short-term memory? So what they usually do is they give them a digit span task. So they'll be like, okay, so can you repeat after the exam administration? And then they'll do something called the digit span. And so let's say it'd be like, can you repeat after me? And without them looking at it, of course, be like, oh, 3825, and then the patient repeats back to you 3825, and you keep doing this for the digit, and you keep adding on the digits. And basically, this test for short-term memory is really an not just testing your memory, but this also testing your attention. Okay, because later on you'll see that um, the part with the memory is not just correctly recalling information back to you in the correct order, but also the ability to manipulate them for the more higher order when it comes to things like the working memory. Okay, so which is what we're going to talk about in the later slides. Okay, now the next thing let's take a look at whether short-term memory is a prerequisite for long-term memory. And later on, you said that there are some conflicting data kind of challenge the the model that you see in the previous two slides, in which that in the short-term memory may not be a prerequisite for long-term memory. And then this comes from the data that is in the patient EE. So what they did is, this patient EE was suffering from some sort of brain disorders, and then need to remove the left angular gyrus. As you can see, that before the surgery it was this much, and then so after the surgery, basically this entire part, a good chunk of it was removed. And so what are the consequences? So what are the consequences of patient EE after removing the actual left angular gyrus aspect of it? Okay, so now let's take a look at the neuropsychological profile of them. You can see that the patient EE has preserved long-term memory and was able to learn and retain new information over time. So that means what? So you would kind of think that, well then patient EE must have correct short-term memory based on the previous model kind of assertions, right? But you see that that's not exactly the case. So and then the patient EE also has preserved visual spatial short-term memory. Okay, but patient EE has impaired verbal short-term memory, which means that this person cannot retain or hold information in his head for a very brief period of time. So what does this mean? But because when you kind of think about the model model, if the model model is correct, that means that short-term memory kind of serve as a filter, as a gateway, if you will, to the long-term memory. So if patient EE can and have preserved the long-term memory, then how is it possible that this person has impaired verbal short-term memory in which he cannot hold his brief period of the time? So the only way that is that these data would kind of suggest is that short-term memory is not necessarily a prerequisite for information to be consolidated into the long-term memory matrix, but rather that these two aspects, the short-term memory is not a prerequisite, but rather an individual functional functionality of the brain, basically. Okay. So which kind of suggests that this entire model is not accurate, at least not completely accurate, but rather the one that you saw in the beginning, in which that there are long-term memory and short-term memory, there are its own individual branch of a memory that's part of like a tree, that's more accurate. So they're more independent from one another, rather than long-term memory is dependent on the formation of the short-term memory, which this kind of patient data from patient EE shows us that is more likely the case, that the two are independently processes. Okay, now let's take a look at the next process, and that is the working memory. Okay, now, so what is working memory? So this was originally done to extend the short-term memory model. So what are the neuropsychology's views on that? So we think that working memory really involves not only the maintenance of information for a brief period of time, but also the manipulation of the material. So this is the key word, the manipulation of the material. Can you use something so when you take the incoming, the encoded information, and not just maintain it and repeat it back to you exactly the same way it was presented to you, but can you kind of move around the sequence? Can you kind of move around, manipulate them? Can you do something to them? All right, so you're probably thinking, well, what do you mean by manipulation? Well, manipulation, though, so this is one of a very easy way how neuropsychologists test for working memory. So they do this as a digit span backwards. So digit span backwards, what we do typically is that the examiner says 1, 2, and then the correct answer, what the patient would repeat back to you is 2, 1. And then, if the examiner says 6, 3, 4, and then the correct answer will be 4, 3, 6. And then if the examiner says 7, 5, 9, 0, and then you're supposed to say back 0, 9, 5, 7. And so the digit span backward is not only looking at the amount of attention that you can pay, but also the extent to what you can manipulate. And now, so when you kind of think about it, you have to first test the way of the digit span forward, right? And then you can kind of say that okay, they have no problem paying attention. Then you can ask them to manipulate them back, because if you want to kind of think of it as if they're not paying attention, if they cannot even do digit span forward, in which that they cannot even pay attention to tell you correctly what they were just been told. To manipulate them backwards, it's even harder for them. So then you don't really have any idea whether or not it's because they're not paying attention, therefore they're having a problem doing the digit span backward, or is it because they have an issue manipulating the material and while at the same time retaining them. So this is one of the hard basically when it comes to testing of the digit span backward task. Now, alternatively, you can give them the letter number sequencing task. So what it is that you tell them that, okay, so I'm gonna give you a string of alphabet and numbers all kind of mixed together. But what I want you to do is to organize them in a way that you tell me all the numbers first and tell me all the ones that were in the number in the sequence in order, in alphabetical order, followed by numbers also in the number sequence. Okay, so for instance, the examiner will say 1A, you will have to manipulate, you have to reorganize it back to A1. Okay, and if the examiner says D2B, and then you have to manipulate back and say B, D2. And then if the examiner says A2, G6, and you have to manipulate and send it back, say AG2, 6. And then let's say that I think now this is one is the hardest one. If the examiner says 6, 9, S, D2, and you have to kind of manipulate and kind of reorganize them and then say it back to them D, S, 2, 6, 9. So you can see that this becomes harder and harder as the number sequence gets larger and larger. And because the amount of the information you need to hold and manipulate back is insane amount, right? So in other words, this is a more accurate and actually a better test when it comes compared to the digit span backwards. And that is because you not only have to kind of manipulate it back in the way that it's in a sequence, but also you need to categorize all of these items in two main categories, right? You need to kind of separate them into alphabet and you need to separate into numbers. So this is something, and then on top of that, after you separate them out, then you have to put them into the correct order within this entire large sequence. So this is something that is a more advanced form of testing a working memory. Okay. Now, so what is the model for the working memory? So Alan Baddeley actually back in the 80s had this idea that there is several aspects that can all contribute to the long-term memory. And so now let's talk about the working memory model first, and then we can talk about how it relates to the long-term memory. So he proposed that there are some aspect when it comes to contributions to the working memory. So originally there were two main components. There is a phonological loop and there is the visual spatial sketchpad. Okay, now within the phonological loop, there are so what the reason why it's called a loop is that because there is an articulatory control system and there is a phonological storage. Okay, so the articular control system is the verbal rehearsal system, basically kind of like the inner voice that you have when someone tell you something and you keep kind of repeating back to yourself, and that's the articular control system. And and then so this is more like a so this is the inner voice that is kind of the time-based capacity that has a certain aspect that you need to kind of pay attention to it, because now the what problem with the phonological loop is that the longer and longer the sequence gets, the less likely you can kind of maintain or contain that within your memory. And now, this articulatory control system and the phonological storage loop are kind of self-perpetuating, in which that the phonological storage is the speech-based storage, and then so this is the inner ear. Now, the thing about the phonological loop is that if you keep mentally rehearsing this over and over again, what it really is that this kind of strengthens the memory aspect of it, and then that may eventually becomes uh, aspect that is more like the long-term storage memory. Okay, okay. Now, so that is the first piece of the model when it comes to the Alan Baddeley's working memory model. So the second part is the the visual spatial sketchpad. So this is more visually based memory, and so now when you kind of think about visual, you can see that this is very spatially oriented. Okay, and then so a lot of people kind of also kind of think that when it comes to the actual long-term storage of the working memory aspect, the phonological loop kind of correspond right to the language aspect, whereas the visual spatial sketchpad more relates to the visual semantics aspect of it. Okay, so so the original system is central executive phonological loop that we talked about and the visual spatial sketchpad. Okay, now the now let's go and talk about the central executive. So this is responsible for integrating and supervising the slave systems. So you're thinking, huh? Slave systems? What are they? Well, the slave systems are the phonological loop and the visual spatial sketchpad. Okay, so it has several main jobs. It's really there is to kind of oversee what is going on between the information that's being presented by the phonological loop as well as the visual spatial sketchpad. And so that's the first thing. And the second thing is kind of is to switch between tasks. So let's say if something is coming through you auditorily, or something is coming you from the visual aspect of it. And then, so that's the second job. And the third job is to selectively paying or inhibiting information. So is actively filtering out stuff that is needed and that is not needed, and what is important, what's not important. So when you kind of think about the central executive aspect, there is definitely an attention component that we talked about in the previous lectures on attention aspect. So you can see that all of these things that we're talking about in our class is a lot of it is depending on one another, and the memory is definitely dependent a lot on attention. Okay, so the more attention that you're paying, the better the memory, well, the higher chance of memory or learning that you will have. Okay, basically. Okay, now one thing I wanted to add in this slide is that the phonological loop is more left hemisphere dominated, and then the visual spatial sketchpad is more right hemisphere dominated. Now there are also views that are really challenging this kind of point, because all of these data before it has the phonological loop, especially they think that it has more to do with the kind of language that we're using, because when you kind of look at uh, language later on, you'll see that language, when it comes to the West Hemisphere languages, are more predominantly left hemisphere dominated. But then when you have other languages such as more Asian language, like say Chinese, for example, this is not only left hemisphere dominated, but this is both hemisphere dominated. So it really has to do with what language you're using specifically. Okay, so we have talked about the phonological loop subsystem that is a process that is being dominated by the left hemisphere, right? And so the now the thing that you kind of want to think about is that we said that there are the articular control and there are the phenomenological storage, right? So what the area that are really important for the articular control, it's the Broman's area number 44 in the left frontal lobe here, and then kind of similar to where the Broca's areas are. And then this left uh, posterior aspect that is important for the phenomenological storage is more at near where the Wernicke's area is. Okay, so the verbal rehearsal will be disrupted if you have lesions in these areas, and why is that? Well, that is because both of these areas are important for the inner voice and also the inner ear. When you kind of think about the repeated storage and also the repeated rehearsal and the maintenance of these area of the process that's involved in the phono- phonological loop subsystem. Okay, so and then now one of the things that we know about, let's say, Broca's and Wernicke's patients is that Broca's patient, they have a real issue of making things coming out in a very fluent way. So that is definitely is going to disrupt the articulate control system. Now, the Wernicke's area really have a problem hearing and comprehending, and is a more accurate word. So comprehending the real meaning behind something. So which all kind of makes sense that when you have lesions in these areas, the Broca's area and the Wernicke's areas, all of these are going to disrupt following the lesion of all of these verbal areas are really responsible for this repeated rehearsal of this process. Now, let's take a look at some imaging data that kind of show us that this is the case. So what they have done is they've done some fMRI studies, and you can see that the verbal memory, when the verbal memory is being is involved, you can see that there are a lot of left hemisphere activities, all right, left hemisphere activities, but not so much in the right hemisphere. Okay, now when we look at the spatial memory, the visual spatial sketchpad, where you are basically saying that you don't see that much left hemisphere activities, but you can see a lot of right hemisphere activity that's going on. So from a superior view, you're seeing that there are a lot of activities on the right, and on the right lateral view, you see that these areas are more lit up during this kind of spatial memory activities. When there are when the task involves more of these visual spatial sketchpad tasks. Now let's talk about the episodic buffer aspect. Okay, so the episodic buffer is something that was not originally in the two slave system, as you saw in the previous slide. So originally there was the phonological loop and there was the visual spatial sketchpad. Now, when it comes to the third buffer, it was not really added until in the year 2000. And then the reason why is it because is that it turns out in some of these data that when people were added in, like when there was a story that's added to something, they can remember this aspect much better, but not when the story was not in there. So basically, what episodic buffer is that there's a subordinate system that integrates a sequence with timing of the event to form a logical story. So the reason why for this is patient they have very little rehearsal. They recall abilities when when they recall significantly more information, when semantic information was stories added. So for instance, if you just kind of tell people like 3, 6, and 9, and then something like that, and then later you when you ask them, they cannot necessarily kind of recall them into the same sequence. But if you added something like, okay, I told John to buy 3 apples so I can make 6 apple pies, and then all of these cost $9. So when you have all these logical stories kind of added into this, and all of a sudden, people remember these numbers much better when you kind of form them and kind of link them into a logical story. So Alan Baddeley thought that there must be another component, another sub-slave system that are kind of interlinked with the phonological loop, as well as as a visual spatial sketchpad, which is also we know is responsible for things like numbers and stuff like that. And then so this buffer kind of interlinked all this aspect, and as well as the central executive, and kind of gels all of them together when a semantic piece is involved. Now, the thing about the episodic buffer, it has not been really investigated empirically, not extensively anyway, because it's something that's very difficult to extrapolate. Okay, so now, so we'll conclude today's lecture here, and then because we're talking about memories for 3 lectures, so I want to make sure that